Hello and welcome to this post-festive season episode of the Strange Playgrounds podcast. Now, as you can no doubt tell from the timbre of my voice, from the croakiness and the sniffles that will occur, as in my Halloween episode, I have a terrible cold, which is a bloody pain. It's stopped me doing quite a lot that I wanted to do over this festive period. I shouldn't even be here. I should be winging my way to Oxfordshire to see some very good friends of mine, but I can't be because I feel like crap. So, here I am, at the behest of certain people who have insisted that I should do the podcast regardless, Jonathan Butcher. Here I am recording this podcastery for you. This is a great time. It's a great time for, not just for horror or for disturbing subjects or whatever, it's a great time for storytelling in general. There is a tradition here in the UK, certainly, whereby the BBC would always produce a ghost story for Christmas. I don't know when that tradition began. I don't know when the ghost story for Christmas began, but it was a common thing throughout the 50s and the 60s. My mother, in particular, had very fond memories of them and introduced me to them. And what they used to be was sort of like plays for today. There used to be these very, very, very low-budget stories of about half an hour to 45 minutes, usually very quiet ghost stories of one form or another. And do not make assumptions based on the nature of the season. These were not holly jolly ghost stories with a sort of redemptive arc in them, like, in a Dickensian sense. These were proper, full-on, horrific, dark ghost stories, and many of them are fantastic. They... as tends to be the case with horror, there is something about horror and low budgets with a lack of resources that seems to push invention. Certainly when it comes to filmmaking, low-budget horror is often the best horror. It's often the most inventive. It's often the horror that actually does want to tell you a story, and it actually does want to distress you somehow, and also isn't concerned about alienating you. That's the big thing. Horror, when it has a budget, when it has, like, studios behind it, suddenly gets very self-conscious. It suddenly has all of these concerns about, oh, well, are we going to alienate this demographic? Is it going to be too distressing? Is it going to be too disturbing? Is it going to be too contrarian? Or is it going to be too transgressive? Is it going to offend these people or those people? And as a result, it becomes diluted. It becomes watered down by test audiences and by board meetings, by studio interference. I mean, the amount of potentially very good horror films that have been destroyed by studio interference is phenomenal. I mean, one of the best examples I can think of is there was a new adaptation of The Wolfman about a decade back, I think. And that film, when it was first optioned, sounded magnificent. It sounded magnificent. Guillermo del Toro was attached to direct. Perfect director for that material. Benicio del Toro was the star. Now, when I first heard that, I just leapt for joy, because the joke of that, the sort of subtle joke of that, is wonderful. It's the fact that with Benicio del Toro, you don't need any makeup or effects to make him look like the Wolfman. That's the joke. However, as the project wore on, we started to see more and more and more of these problems that were recurring. Studios would fund it, then they would drop it, then they would want to change it. Guillermo got pissed off by all accounts and then dropped the project entirely, so another director then came on. Actors came, actors went, directors came and went. New scripts were introduced to make it more like this, to make it more like that. And eventually, after I think it was about a decade of production, this thing did come out. This bizarre hybrid chimera thing, which is it's the oddest creature imaginable. Totally unsuccessful. I mean, it's a terrible film because it doesn't know what it wants to be. Because it has all of these weird influences from lots of different writers and directors, the film doesn't know where it's going. Sometimes it feels like a a legitimate sort of old-fashioned universal horror film. Then it turns into a CG-laden, and bad CG, by the way, a terrible CG-laden horror action film. Then it becomes very quiet and becomes this sort of Victorian period piece, this sort of drama of manners almost. Then it becomes a psychological tragedy. Then it becomes a family drama. Then it goes back to being a terrible action film. It doesn't know what it wants to be, and there's no directorial stamp on it. There are scenes and sequences that just don't fit with all of the other scenes and sequences. It's an awful mishmash, and for me, it's a grand example of what happens when you have too much money behind something, because this thing had money behind it, that much is very clear. Big studios are involved in this. When you have too much studio interference, when the vision of a very finite number of people is compromised, you get bad work. You just get bad work. Don't get me wrong, sometimes when you let directors and writers go off on their own, you get bad work as well. But at the very least, in that instance, the bad work is going to have a stamp on it. At least it's going to have some ethos, some direction. Even if it fails, it will be interesting. Even if it's bad, it will be interesting. This is just a mess. It's a total mess. And for me, the old BBC plays for today, the old ghost stories for Christmas, are the best examples of how when you just let filmmakers and writers go away with their camera crews and with their editing equipment, you just let them go away to some remote spot and create something that's entirely their own, you get something beautiful. Very often, these Christmas ghost stories were based on the stories of M.R. James. And M.R. James really is, if you want to write a ghost story, then that M.R. James is where you go. M.R. James is the authority upon classically structured ghost stories. There is this wonderful quiescence and distance to his ghost stories. This subtlety where nothing much is really explained, things just happen, and they escalate so beautifully. So beautifully. One of the very best I can think of is an adaptation of an M.R. James ghost story, which is Whistle and I'll Come to You. Whistle and I'll Come to You, the original version, the 1963 version, I believe, is when it originally came out. It's black and white. It stars Michael Hordern, aka Paddington, the voice of Paddington from Paddington Bear from the old cartoons. And an inveterate actor for British television. And it shouldn't work. It's readily available, by the way. There is a wonderful, wonderful BBC DVD that has all of these things on. If you go to somewhere like Amazon or wherever, you will be able to find these things. There's a big, big, big box set DVD that has all of them in, and it is stunning. It is absolutely stunning. Whistle and I'll Come to You is the quietest thing. There is barely any dialogue in it. It has all of these long, lingering, silent shots of landscape that are in black and white, and therefore have this sort of moribund eeriness. They look almost sepulchral in nature. These long shots where you're seeing sort of wind-swept British beaches in the midst of winter, and these distant figures that you can't quite make out, that could be spectral in and of themselves. It's beautiful. There's hardly any dialogue. Michael Hordern's character is this odd bloke, this strange, isolated academic who's not very nice, by all accounts, who's kind of a stuffed shirt, conservative, isolated, slightly rude twat, really. And you don't hear much of him. He doesn't... What I love about it is that you get a sense of his character without him saying very much at all. And that's wonderful. He's staying at a sort of bedsit for the holiday season. And he goes rambling across the beaches, and he finds this old, like a barrow, an old burial site. There is a marker, but it's like a little stone that's worn to nothing, and he takes a whistle from it. He takes this old whistle from it, and as he's walking back, the original show makes nothing of this. It makes nothing of it, but he turns back at one point and looks across the beach, and there is just up in the distance, this vague figure that could be anyone. It could be anything. It could be just another rambler. It could be someone just standing on the beach, but you can't see it clearly. It's just a silhouette, and it is brilliantly chilling because he doesn't make anything of it. The character doesn't make anything of it, and nor does the actual film. It doesn't have any fucking orchestra stings or anything like that. Anything that sort of tries to preempt you as the audience into feeling a particular way. It just presents you with the images, and it is very cold, very chilling. It actually makes you feel sort of like a hand of ice in your heart. And after that, after he returns to the bedsit, things start to happen. But as in all the very best ghost stories, when they start to happen, they are not things that automatically have supernatural explanation or implications even. They could be explained by other things. For example, he hears noises. He hears what sounds like maybe rats in the skirting board, or scurrying around in his room beneath the floorboards, that kind of thing, or which may in fact be fingers scratching away. It's hard to tell. He has odd dreams. He sees sort of silhouettes underneath the door, It's that kind of thing. It's the wonderful classic ghostly spectral stuff that you find in haunting stories, but done so well that the cliche reinvents itself. And don't get me wrong, most of M.R. James' ghost stories, because they've informed the way ghost stories are shaped, certainly here in the UK so profoundly, are the classic archetypal ghost stories. They follow that structure. They have elements to them that would in any other work be cliche. I mean, this one, and by the way, there are spoilers here. I'd advise going to watch this before you listen to the rest of this podcast. The haunting culminates when it reveals itself as actually being supernatural, when you have the ultimate cliche, which is it is literally a ghost in a sheet. There's a sequence where Michael Horden's character is in bed, and the bed adjacent to his that is vacant. He's staying in this double room on his own. The sheets start to rise from it in this weird kind of wavy-like pattern, and he sits there like literally sucking his thumb like a child and whimpering as these sheets start to rise and sort of form a vague ephemeral figure. Now, it shouldn't work. Just like the rest of it, it shouldn't work. The ghost in the sheet is the most cliche thing imaginable, but it does. It's absolutely chilling. That sequence, because of the way it's filmed, because of the way it's framed, because of the build-up, is absolutely terrifying. It's wonderful. It is absolutely wonderful. There are others. I don't know whether this was a ghost story for Christmas, but I suspect it was. Later on, there was an adaptation of Charles Dickens' The Signalman. And for those of you who have read it, you know that The Signalman is a spectacular ghost story, full of very unusual implications for the time it was written. And they are implications that the BBC adaptation carry over. Again, this is available on this DVD that's out there. Go and watch it. Please go and watch it. It's really good. The adaptation of The Signalman is quite long. I think it's about an hour long, and it's wonderfully protracted. You don't really see very much. There is hardly anything in it that suggests anything supernatural until right at the end. It's more about the relationship between this Victorian gentleman who is wandering around the countryside and the eponymous signalman who he happens across in his when we used to have signalmen for the railway systems here in the UK, who is ensconced in his signal box. He befriends him and keeps coming back to see him, as reluctant and unusual and odd and taciturn as the signalman himself is. And as the story progresses, he starts to tell this story about a particular crash that occurred because of some negligence on behalf of what you assume to be another signalman, like his predecessor perhaps. But it becomes apparent that there's more going on. I won't spoil it, but there's much more going on. The BBC adaptation is beautiful. There is a sequence in the original book which involves a train crash, like a steam engine crash, which obviously the budget for these things doesn't stretch to. You could not recreate it. These things were often produced for like 50 pence and half a curly whirly, and that's it. That was their budget. Maybe there was a dib dab in there if someone at the BBC thought the project was worthwhile. So what the Signalman does to recreate the concept of the steam engine crash. And for those of you out there who have never read accounts of what happens when steam engines crash, go and do it. It's horrific. They were beautiful things. I love steam engines, but bloody hell, they didn't crash often. By the way, it was very rare indeed for a steam engine to crash. But when they did, they went up like Vesuvius. The horror of that situation is unfathomable. And this particular crash occurs in the tunnel that's nearby the signalman's signal box. And the way the BBC adaptation portrays it is in this very symbolic, almost slightly Dario Argento way. You get a lot of weird lighting and a lot of sounds and a lot of silhouettes, which contrast massively with the almost documentary realism of the rest of the adaptation. Well worth going to check out. It's beautiful, absolutely beautiful. And it's a tradition that went away for a little while. The BBC stopped doing it around Christmas time, which is a massive shame. Or rather, they transplanted it into something else. You sort of had like the Doctor Who Christmas specials, which I suppose were kind of similar, as terrible as they were. They often shunted the ghost stories for Christmas to, say, the radio channels like BBC Radio 4 or whatever. But more recently, they started producing them again. There was another adaptation of Whistle and I'll Come to You I think it's about 6 years back, which starred John Hurt. Great casting. Unfortunately, the adaptation just isn't a patch on the original one, for the very reasons I was talking about before. It has a budget. B, it has investment in it. It has the BBC obviously put money into it, and it has John Hurt. So they build it up. They built it up as being something significant, and as a result, they couldn't allow it to be as first of all, as ropey as the original one. And the original one is very ropey. I mean, there's nothing to it. There is literally nothing to it. It's a very simple film. They couldn't allow it to be as disturbing as the original one, or to be as quiet. It had to have more of a sort of traditional structure. It had to have more of the clean-cut explanations for what's going on. Way more dialogue, way more interactions between the characters. There's hardly any in the original. It focuses almost exclusively on Michael Horden's character. As a result, John Hurt is wonderful in it, as he's wonderful in everything. I love John Hurt in everything. But the problem with the adaptation is it's way too overt. It happens way too quickly. It nails its colours to the mast very quickly. It's definitely supernatural what's happening. And the ending is terrible. It just doesn't work as well as the original. That may be because of the context provided by the original, but it's also because this version has budget. It's because they're trying to bill it as something significant. And that's a real shame. That's a real shame. I mean, if anyone could have made that work, if there was a central performance that could have really sold that, it would have been John Hurt, who is one of my favourite actors of all time, quite frankly. I love John Hurt. It's just not as good. There was one this year, actually, which was not very well advertised by the BBC at all. I didn't even know it happened. I didn't even know it occurred. Again, it was shunted over to BBC 4. Not the radio channel, but the TV channel BBC 4, which the BBC generally knows that hardly anyone watches. And this time, the star was Simon Callow, again, another actor. One of these inveterate British actors. This seems to be a tradition with these things. They get inveterate, iconic British actors from television to play the central role. Simon Callow, who many of you will recognise from cinema, from TV, from all sorts of places. Simon Callow works all the time. He's in so much stuff. He's brilliant. I love Simon Callow. It was called The Dead Room, and it's all right. It's okay, but it's only okay. It's certainly not a patch on the ghost stories for Christmas that came before. It's certainly not a patch on the old low-budget black and white ones. Once again, there is a budget here. And it's alright, it's fine, there is absolutely nothing wrong with it. It's like a classic ghost story that is presuming to comment upon ghost stories in the same way that the Inside Number 9 Halloween special did. By the way, if anyone didn't see that, go and watch it. The Inside Number 9 Halloween special was stunning. Absolutely stunning. It paid homage to one of my favourite Halloween bits of media ever in the form of Ghostwatch, Stephen Volk's Ghostwatch. In that, it's a sort of meta story. It's a story that's commenting upon the nature of stories, the nature of these holiday specials, of producing stories, and of the storytellers themselves. It actually involves the storytellers, i.e. Reece Shearsmith and Steve Pemberton, in the story. It's very clever. Very, very clever. The Dead Room is more contained. It's more contained, it's more traditional. It's notable because it has a central character that's gay. That's interesting. That's not something you encounter very much. Certainly not in these traditional ghost stories, outside of implication, but this guy is overtly gay. And the central plot revolves around something from his past that is not unique, but would be peculiar to gay men who were young during the era that he was young. Let's put it that way. I won't spoil it for you if you want to go and watch it, but it's interesting. It's interesting. It's not the kind of thing I would go out of my way to watch because it is a little bit conservative. It's a little bit predictable. But it is very well put together. It's very well put together. The central performance is very good. It's obviously, again, got a budget. So it looks good. It looks fine. Again, it's sort of presuming to comment upon itself. It's sort of a meta story. It's commenting upon the nature of these holiday specials or ghost stories at this particular festive time of year. And it largely succeeds in what it attempts to do. I suppose the big problem with it is that it's not massively ambitious. It is not perhaps as deviant or as transgressive as it maybe could have been. It's very well put together, though. It's worth a watch, and as sort of like a 45-minute diversion on Christmas, I could see how it would have been quite fun. But I do find myself wishing for a return to the old status quo where the BBC were not quite as invested in these things, where they would allow the filmmakers to just go away and film this stuff with maybe the writer in tow and like a ragtag crew of camera people and very, very limited special effects people whom excuse me, whom the writer and director would then have to go and help to do everything because they hadn't the budget to pay everyone, that kind of thing. I would like to see a bit more of the guerrilla filmmaking that typifies the old ghost stories for Christmas. I really, really would. And the quiescence that comes with them. The quiescence without the last minute reveals, without the last minute jump scares, which sadly this one does fall prey to. Without there being anything overt. I would really love to see that. But yes, it's a wonderful tradition, actually, the ghost stories for Christmas. It really is, and I would love to see the BBC run with it a bit more. In fact, I would love them, now that sort of Doctor Who has been shunted, mercifully, quite frankly, from the Christmas slot, why not replace it with the ghost stories for Christmas and run with it, push it. There's an appetite out there. There really is an appetite out there. As anyone who's seen the viewing figures for Netflix's Black Mirror episode Bandersnatch will be able to demonstrate, there is an appetite for this stuff. It just seems that when it comes to horror, outlets like the BBC are really cautious these days. They're really cautious because they don't want to upset or offend or to cause controversy. They know that the likes of the Daily fucking Mail and the Sun and the sort of right-wing press are looking at them and waiting for any excuse to leap on them. So they are overly cautious with this stuff. They either dilute it deliberately so it's really not that terrifying or disturbing or transgressive, or they shunt it to like the dead slots on some dead channel like BBC 4 or whatever, where it just won't cause much offence because nobody will see it. It's a great shame. It's a great shame. I think if they just said fuck it and just ran with this, if they got lots of different aspiring filmmakers and writers from around the country together and maybe ran a competition with it to see, gave them a limited budget and gave them the equipment and just said, go and make what you like and we'll run it. We'll run it as a series. We'll run the most successful as a series. I think you'd get some amazing work. You'd get ropey work, you'd get work that's imperfect, but it would be really interesting. You'd get these new voices exploring more postmodern themes, more themes that are more relevant to today, really. That's one of the big problems with the ghost stories for Christmas, the old ones, the traditional ones, is that they tended to be set in previous eras. So they tended to be set in Victoriana, or sort of like the turn of the 20th century. So the themes that they explored were maybe more specific to those eras. It would be wonderful to see sort of a more urban version of those stories, a more sort of tower block, sink estate, a more sort of working class under the Tories exploration of these themes and subjects, because I think the horror is perfectly suited to exploring those concerns. It really is. I think you'd get some massively interesting work, I really do. And not only that, I think you'd get an audience. I think there is this craving out there for genuinely transgressive material. People just don't know it. They don't know they want it because they're force-fed on a diet of banality. They don't realise that they want it. And this could be the thing. This could be it. I mean, what I would love to see, and I've written scripts for this myself, I would love to get it produced. I would love to see something new, something interesting. Like, for example, what about something like Jam, like Chris Morris's Jam, which is ostensibly marketed as a comedy, but which treads the line. It is just on the edge of being horror. What about if you took it over the edge? What about if you did something that has the format of a sketch show, but is little horror shorts instead of little comedy shorts? Wouldn't that be wonderful? Wouldn't that be fantastic? I mean, as I say, I'm working on a script for exactly that, which I might produce on here, actually. I might just get one of my independent filmmaker friends to help me produce it for this channel, because it wouldn't require a budget or anything like that. In fact, it'd probably be better without one. But wouldn't that be wonderful? Wouldn't that be stunning? And really, I mean, the only other thing I want to say is that the tradition that I was talking about of the ghost stories for Christmas that the BBC runs with is part of a much older tradition. It is in and of itself something that traces way back to the origins of Christmas and of the festive season itself. I mean, it's this wonderfully complex, polyglot, millennia-spanning phenomena whereby loads of different oral traditions and mythologies have come together to form this holiday. The notion of storytelling around Christmas has been around for as long as there have been human beings knocking about, quite frankly. It is very, in a very real sense, the postmodern equivalent of stories around the campfire. The cautionary tales around the campfire, of the dark and of the woods and of the tribe beyond the river. It's very, very much that. And I love that. I love that sensation. I love that feeling that this is something mythologically traditional, I suppose, and something that's peculiarly human, that expresses something peculiarly human about us. Well, I think I've rabbited on for far too long, and I'm feeling very, 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 very stuffed up and off colour now. So, I will sign off with an urging, an imperative. Please go and watch some of these old plays for today. Please go and watch The Signalman. Go and watch The Stone Tapes. Go and watch Whistle and I'll Come to You, the original version. Find them. Go find them. They're readily available. Go find the M.R. James ghost story adaptations from the BBC. They are stunning. They are absolutely stunning. And until next time, ladies and gentlemen, hope I'm feeling better. Bye-bye!